There is a hidden price for seeing too much. Most people imagine insight as a gift. They think that if you can read beneath appearances, if you can sense motives behind words, if you can detect the fracture beneath the polished surface, then life must become easier. They assume clarity brings power. They assume perception brings freedom. They assume truth protects the one who discovers it. But often the opposite is true. To see what others refuse to see is not only a cognitive burden. It is a social burden. It isolates. It unsettles. It attracts resistance. It can turn a room cold without a single word being spoken. Because the crowd does not love the one who sees clearly. The crowd fears that person. And what people fear, they often resent. What they resent, they attempt to silence. This is one of the deepest and most painful psychological realities a person can face. The moment you begin to see through people, through systems, through masks, through rituals of false belonging, you are no longer merely living among others. You are living among defenses. Carl Jung understood something essential about human beings. We are not ruled only by reason, and we are not held together only by truth. Much of human life is organized around protection from truth. Not total truth, not unbearable truth, not the kind of truth that threatens identity, hierarchy, self-image, or emotional survival. People do not merely hide things from others. They hide things from themselves. They construct personalities, loyalties, and beliefs not only to express who they are, but to avoid confronting what they cannot tolerate. And this is why the perceptive person becomes dangerous. Not because they are violent, not because they are cruel, but because they are difficult to manage in a world built on mutual performance. Most social order is not based on honesty. It is based on agreement. Unspoken agreement. Agreement about what should be ignored. Agreement about which lies are useful. Agreement about which contradictions are too expensive to expose. Agreement about how much truth a group can handle before it begins to fracture. In every family, workplace, friendship circle, institution, and culture, there are things people know without admitting they know. There are tensions everyone feels but cannot name. There are hypocrisies that are tolerated because confronting them would threaten comfort, reputation, or power. The crowd survives by maintaining these zones of silence. It does not call them lies. It calls them peace. Then someone arrives who sees. Sometimes that person sees the manipulation beneath kindness. Sometimes they notice the envy behind praise. Sometimes they detect cowardice disguised as politeness, domination disguised as care, conformity disguised as morality. Sometimes they see that a family is built around fear, that a leader is held up by insecurity, that a friendship survives only through mutual dishonesty. Sometimes they see that an entire community depends on scapegoating one person so that the rest never have to examine themselves. And once seen, these things cannot be unseen. This is where the suffering begins. Because insight does not merely reveal reality. It reveals your distance from the people around you. You begin to feel the gap between what is being said and what is actually happening. You hear the words, but you hear the motive beneath them. You watch the smiles, but you also see the strain inside them. You notice who is performing, who is hiding, who is compensating, who is collapsing, who is lying to themselves so deeply that they have mistaken it for character. At first, this feels like maturity. Then it feels like loneliness. The tragedy is that most people do not want to be seen in this way. They want to be affirmed in the image they present. They want to be met at the level of persona, not essence. Jung used the word persona to describe the social mask, the version of ourselves we develop to function in the world, to gain approval, to fulfill expectations, to belong. The persona is not always fake in a simple sense. It often contains real elements of the self. But it is still selective. It is still curated. It is still shaped to manage how others perceive us. And the crowd is built out of personas negotiating with other personas. That is why genuine perception destabilizes social life. To see beyond the mask is to break a contract no one openly admits exists. The contract says, I will accept your surface if you accept mine. I will not expose what you are hiding if you do not expose what I am hiding. We will call this respect. We will call this maturity. We will call this getting along. But beneath that civilized arrangement lies fear. The fear of being known too deeply. The fear of having one's shadow exposed. Jung's concept of the shadow remains one of the most devastating psychological ideas ever introduced, because it explains why people so often hate the person who speaks truth. The shadow is everything in ourselves that we repress, deny, disown, or judge unacceptable. It includes impulses, desires, weaknesses, resentment, vanity, aggression, dependency, selfishness, cowardice, cruelty, and hunger for power. It also contains unrealized strength, creativity, and depth that a person may fear because it threatens the identity they have built. Most people do not integrate the shadow. They project it. They locate their denied qualities in someone else. They condemn in others what they cannot bear in themselves. They accuse others of manipulation while manipulating. They call others arrogant while secretly craving superiority. They denounce selfishness while quietly organizing the world around their own needs. This projection allows the ego to remain clean. It protects the conscious self-image. Now imagine what happens when someone enters the room who sees projection for what it is. That person is not merely inconvenient. They are intolerable, because their presence threatens the machinery by which the group preserves innocence. This is why groups often turn against the most perceptive member, not the least moral one. The group can tolerate many sins: pettiness, dishonesty, hypocrisy, passive aggression, mediocrity, even cruelty, if those things remain covered by ritual language and shared denial. What the group cannot easily tolerate is revelation. It cannot tolerate the person whose eyes make pretense harder to maintain. This is the social cost of insight. You may be hated not for what you do, but for what your perception makes others feel in your presence. People feel naked around someone who sees clearly. They may not say it that way. They may say you are intense, difficult, negative, cold, arrogant, overthinking, dramatic, or unsettling. They may accuse you of creating problems when in reality you are only refusing to participate in the performance that hides them. They may say you think you are better than everyone else, when in fact what they resent is not your superiority but your unwillingness to remain asleep beside them. The crowd especially hates the person who sees collective weakness. An individual can sometimes tolerate being understood. A crowd rarely can. Crowds are emotionally fragile because they are held together by contagion. They feed on mirrored reassurance. Each person borrows certainty from the others. Each person feels safer because everyone around them appears to agree. But when one person refuses the collective illusion, something disturbing happens. The illusion stops feeling total. The silence breaks. The hidden tension becomes visible. And the crowd, sensing the threat, moves instinctively to neutralize the source. This is why history is full of scapegoats, exiles, heretics, whistleblowers, outcasts, prophets, inconvenient thinkers, and emotionally honest people who were punished not because they were wrong, but because they saw too early, too clearly, or too publicly. The crowd does not always destroy them with violence. More often it uses subtler weapons: mockery, exclusion, character assassination, misrepresentation, passive hostility, social freezing, feigning concern while undermining credibility, reducing complexity to pathology, turning truth into a personality flaw. This is one of the oldest forms of power. If you cannot refute what the person sees, make the person appear unstable. If you cannot restore the illusion, isolate the observer. If you cannot force them to agree, make others afraid to stand beside them. The tragedy becomes even deeper when the insightful person is still psychologically unprepared for what they carry. Seeing clearly is not the same as being strong. Some people awaken to reality before they have built the emotional structure required to live with it. They begin to notice motives, contradictions, manipulation, falseness, cowardice, envy, and collective self-deception, but they do not yet know how to metabolize what they see. They become reactive, bitter, hyper-vigilant. They may start naming truths compulsively, as if exposure itself will free them. But truth delivered without timing, containment, or discernment can become self-destructive. This is another danger Jung recognized. Insight can inflate the ego as easily as it can deepen the soul. The person who sees through others may begin to identify with the role of seer, outsider, or awakened one. They may become secretly attached to being the one who knows. And the moment this happens, insight starts to corrupt itself. Perception becomes identity. Identity becomes superiority. Superiority becomes blindness of another kind. Because to truly see is also to see oneself. To see one's own shadow, one's own projections, one's own hunger to be right, one's own temptation to weaponize truth, one's own private fantasy of being above the crowd. The deepest insight is humbling, not intoxicating. It strips away innocence from both sides. It reveals not only the weakness of others, but the darkness within the observer. If a person cannot do this inner work, their perception becomes sharp but unclean. They will still see much, but what they see will pass through resentment, pride, or unhealed wounds. Then they become easier for the crowd to dismiss, because their truth comes wrapped in contempt. That is why the burden of insight is not merely to perceive. It is to perceive without becoming possessed by what one sees. This is exceedingly difficult, because once you begin to notice the mechanics of social life, innocence is hard to recover. You start seeing how people negotiate status through language, how guilt is used to control, how weakness hides beneath moral certainty, how flattery masks competition, how entire relationships survive on selective blindness. You begin to notice that many people do not want connection as much as they want reassurance. They do not want truth as much as they want emotional regulation. They do not want transformation as much as they want a stable story in which they remain good, justified, and central. And once you see that, you may begin to withdraw. Not dramatically, not all at once, but inwardly. You speak less. You explain less. You reveal less. You watch more. You stop trying to persuade people who are invested in misunderstanding. You stop forcing depth into conversations designed to remain shallow. You stop expecting self-knowledge from those who depend on self-deception. This withdrawal can look like coldness from the outside, but often it is simply adaptation. The psyche learns where truth is not welcome. It learns the cost of speaking before the conditions for hearing exist. Still, the loneliness remains. Because human beings are not made only for perception. They are also made for resonance. To see deeply and feel deeply without being met is exhausting. It can create the painful sense of living among surfaces. Many perceptive people experience this early in life, especially in families where truth was dangerous. A child may notice the unspoken tension between parents, the resentment beneath care, the instability behind appearances, the emotional rules that no one explains but everyone obeys. Such a child becomes sensitive not by choice, but by necessity. They learn to read mood, tone, contradiction, danger. Their perception becomes a survival tool. But later in life, that same gift can become a burden. They enter new environments and immediately detect what others miss. They read the room too quickly. They feel falseness before facts confirm it. They sense fractures in people's stories. Yet when they respond to what they perceive, they are often treated as the problem. They are told they are imagining things, overreacting, being too serious, making others uncomfortable. This creates a devastating psychological split. You see what is there, but you are trained to doubt yourself because the group refuses confirmation. This is how insightful people can be gaslit by the collective. Not always deliberately, but effectively. Reality is denied at the social level, and the one who perceives it begins to wonder whether clarity itself is a form of pathology. Jung would say that individuation, the path of becoming a whole human being, requires the courage to endure this tension. To individuate is not to become antisocial or grandiose. It is to stop surrendering your inner reality to collective pressure. It is to stand in relation to the truth of your own perception without needing immediate validation from the group. This is not easy. It means tolerating misunderstanding. It means surviving seasons of invisibility. It means losing cheap forms of belonging in order to preserve psychic integrity. Many people never do this. They betray their perception to stay connected. They laugh at what they know is false. They agree with what disturbs them. They remain silent when they should speak. They speak when they should remain silent, but only in ways that keep them acceptable. They perform normalcy while inwardly shrinking. And over time, this betrayal creates a different kind of suffering: self-alienation. The soul pays for every truth it is forced to abandon. That is why the cost of insight has two sides. On one side is social punishment. On the other side is self-betrayal. If you speak, you may lose belonging. If you stay silent, you may lose yourself. Wisdom lies not in naive honesty or strategic conformity alone, but in learning when, where, and how truth can live. Not every truth must be spoken aloud. Not every perception deserves immediate expression. Not every crowd is worthy of your clarity. One of the marks of maturity is learning the difference between revelation and waste. There are people who can hear difficult truths because they have done enough inner work not to collapse under them. There are also environments so invested in illusion that speaking truth there only feeds hostility, projection, and punishment. Discernment matters. Timing matters. Symbolic intelligence matters. Sometimes truth must be spoken directly. Sometimes it must be encoded, delayed, or lived rather than declared. The wise person does not expose everything they see, not because they are cowardly, but because they understand the psychological economy of revelation. They know that forcing awareness on the unready can be experienced as violence. They know that the ego defends itself with enormous force. They know that insight without compassion becomes brutality, and compassion without insight becomes collusion. This is where many people misunderstand strength. Strength is not compulsive truth-telling. Strength is not theatrical detachment. Strength is not humiliating others with your accuracy. Strength is the capacity to remain inwardly loyal to what you see without becoming enslaved to the need to prove it. This kind of strength has dignity. It no longer begs to be believed. It no longer panics when the crowd rejects it. It no longer explains itself to those who interpret honesty as threat. It understands that reality does not disappear because it is denied. And yet, this strength is not cynical. It does not reduce all people to masks and manipulations. If your perception becomes purely suspicious, then the crowd has wounded you more deeply than you realize. Real insight does not only reveal corruption. It reveals woundedness, longing, fear, imitation, hunger for love, terror of exclusion, inherited shame. It shows that many people are false not because they are monsters, but because they are fragile. They cling to performance because they do not know how to survive exposure. They attack the person who sees because being seen feels like annihilation. To understand this does not mean excusing everything. It means perceiving more completely. The crowd hates those who see because seeing threatens the dream that keeps the crowd coherent. But the crowd is not a supernatural enemy. It is made of human beings who are afraid. Afraid of shame. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of losing the story that keeps them functional. Afraid of the shadow. Afraid of standing alone with what is real. And if we are honest, we must admit that some part of us shares that fear. Every human being has moments of preferring illusion to truth. Every human being wants to be loved without being fully exposed. Every human being edits themselves to survive. So the one who sees is not a different species. They are simply the one less able or less willing to remain unconscious. That is both gift and burden. If you are such a person, you may have already learned that clarity changes your relationships. People who once felt comfortable around you begin to grow guarded. Those who depend on surface harmony may call you heavy. Those who manipulate subtly may avoid direct contact with you. Some will become defensive without knowing why. Others will idealize you at first, attracted to your depth, only to resent you later when they realize your presence makes self-deception more difficult. You may experience a pattern in which people seek your understanding but resist your perception. They want your empathy, but not your honesty. They want to feel seen, but not discovered. This contradiction is exhausting. It teaches you that many forms of intimacy are conditional. People want depth only up to the point where depth begins to cost them something. Still, this should not drive you into despair. Because while the crowd may punish insight, life also contains those rare individuals who have suffered enough, reflected enough, and grown enough to welcome it. They do exist. They may be few, but they exist. These are the people for whom truth is not an attack but an invitation. They do not need to protect themselves with constant projection. They are capable of being unsettled without becoming vindictive. They can hear difficult things without rushing to destroy the messenger. In their presence, your perception becomes less of a wound and more of a bond. These are not comfortable people in the shallow sense. But they are real. And one real connection can matter more than 100 social approvals built on mutual blindness. This is why the path of insight is not ultimately about winning against the crowd. It is about becoming someone who can bear reality without collapsing into hatred, superiority, or despair. It is about preserving the soul in a world that often rewards performance more than truth. It is about learning to carry what you see with precision, humility, and restraint. It is about finding the few places where your clarity can become service rather than isolation. There is also another truth the crowd rarely understands: the one who sees suffers first. People often imagine that the perceptive person enjoys exposing hypocrisy, reading motives, and watching illusions break. But true perception is not always pleasurable. Often it hurts. It hurts to feel the distance between people's words and their hearts. It hurts to sense the self-abandonment beneath performance. It hurts to witness the repetition of unconscious patterns across generations. It hurts to know that many conflicts are not really about facts but about wounds no one is ready to name. The perceptive person often carries more grief, not less, because they see what others protect themselves from seeing. That grief can either ripen into wisdom or harden into bitterness. The choice matters. If you let bitterness lead, you will begin to hate the crowd as much as the crowd hates being seen. You will become rigid, contemptuous, unable to recognize innocence or complexity. But if you let grief deepen you, something else emerges. You become quieter, clearer, less reactive. You no longer need to expose everything. You no longer confuse visibility with impact. You no longer expect the unconscious to applaud the one who reveals it. You understand that much of human resistance is tragic before it is malicious. And then your insight changes character. It becomes steadier, cleaner, more dangerous perhaps, but in the right way. Not because it dominates, but because it cannot be recruited into falsehood. At that point, the crowd may still misunderstand you. It may still distrust you. It may still prefer the charming liar, the reassuring performer, the confident fraud, the emotionally convenient voice over the one who sees more deeply. But your relationship to that rejection changes. It no longer defines you. You stop trying to earn belonging by dimming your perception. You stop apologizing for the truths your nervous system registers. You stop mistaking social approval for psychological health. And this is where a deeper freedom begins. The freedom to see without shouting. The freedom to know without proving. The freedom to stand apart without worshiping your separateness. The freedom to speak only when speech serves something real. The freedom to let the crowd keep some of its illusions while refusing to live inside them yourself. This freedom is expensive, but so is blindness. In the end, perhaps that is the real dividing line in human life. Not between the strong and the weak, not between the intelligent and the foolish, but between those willing to sacrifice truth for belonging and those willing to sacrifice belonging, at least sometimes, for truth. Neither path is painless, but only one allows the soul to remain intact. So if you have felt hated, excluded, misread, or quietly punished because you noticed what others wanted hidden, do not rush to assume you are broken. Sometimes what the crowd calls negativity is simply unembellished perception. Sometimes what the crowd calls arrogance is refusal to kneel before collective denial. Sometimes what the crowd calls intensity is what truth feels like in a world addicted to performance. But remember this too: your gift is not merely to see through others. It is to see through yourself with equal honesty, to watch your pride, to guard against bitterness, to refuse the seduction of moral superiority, to remain human while becoming lucid. That is the hard path. That is the noble path. And that is the path Jung pointed toward when he insisted that the great work is not to become acceptable, but to become whole. Wholeness is costly. It will expose you to misunderstanding. It will separate you from certain kinds of easy belonging. It will force you to build an inner center stronger than public approval. But it will also give you something the crowd cannot offer: a life not built on self-betrayal. And perhaps that is the deepest answer to why the crowd hates those who see. Because the person who sees reminds them of the truth they abandoned in order to remain comfortable. Because the person who sees threatens the agreement beneath the performance. Because the person who sees stands too close to the shadow. And because somewhere, behind the resentment, the crowd suspects that this person is free in a way it is not. If this message spoke to something real inside you, subscribe to Perpetual Echoes for more deep explorations of psychology, shadow, power, and the hidden structure of human nature. And if you have ever paid the social price for seeing too much, leave a comment below. I want to know what truth changed the way you see people forever.